Hey everyone, welcome back to this limited series podcast called Queer AuDHD BIPOC. Once again, I'm TQ, a queer, trans, disabled Chinese Singaporean AuDHDer and a student of this community. And this podcast and upcoming book is to help other queer, Black, Brown, Indigenous, Asian, South Asian, Middle Eastern, and other people of color who are both autistic and ADHD feel seen, less alone, and supported while living in multiple margins. And today I'm joined by Kaligirwa, whose handle is Black Spectrum Scholar on Instagram and pretty much everywhere else. Would you mind introducing yourself and how you identify to the audience?
So my name is Kaligirwa. I'm a 27-year-old AuDHDer from Quebec, Canada. I make online content focused on advocacy awareness, on awareness of neurodiversity, and as well as how it interplays with intersectionality.
Would you like to share how, like, your journey of pursuing a diagnosis? How did you start to figure out, like, hey, maybe I should go get diagnosed?
So my journey, how it started, initially, I did not pursue my ADHD diagnosis. I was referred for an ADHD diagnosis when I was in the first grade of high school by a history geography teacher that I had, who suspected that I might have had ADHD. I was evaluated by a psychologist, and it was found that I had ADHD, and that's how my journey began. Afterwards, I was given prescription medication to manage my ADHD, but I still had a lot of challenges that were unaddressed by the medication. 2 years later, at 15 years old, I started suspecting that I might also be autistic alongside being ADHD. And then I didn't explore deeply my identity and how I felt about that because I had someone close to me that was already diagnosed with, at the time, Asperger's, and who told me that it was not possible for me to be autistic and ADHD. So that pretty much cut me short in my journey, which at the time she was right that it wasn't possible to be autistic and ADHD at the same time. So I just went on and I received shortly after a diagnosis of generalized anxiety disorder. And by the end of my high school, I had also received another adjustment disorder diagnosis. So no one really knew what I was going through, and I took medication for many years, but I was battling with a lot of side effects, like taking the medication and just crashing as soon as I ate and came home. Had a lot of socialization challenges, despite the fact that my impulsivity and inattention were now better managed. I didn't think much of it, and I left for college at 17. And at 17, I still had a lot of ongoing relational challenges. I was in the dorms in college, and not even 6 months after I started college, I was kicked out from the dorms because I couldn't get along with my roommates, and I had some issues there too. Throughout my life, I still had a lot of issues that were unaddressed, and I didn't think that it was autism because I was in the back of my mind. It couldn't be autism because I had a friend who was autistic who told me that it wasn't that. At some point, I had another mental health crisis episode in which I was hospitalized against my will for a few days. And at that point, I was maybe perhaps 20, and I put myself on the waiting list for an assessment of any kind, just an assessment to know what was going on back then.
Okay.
So basically, and like I just waited to be assessed for any kind of condition that I might explain what I was struggling with at the time. So then I went back home, and I live in Canada, so like waiting lists for assessment can be quite long. And I knew that going into it, but I didn't expect it to be that long because what happened is, and what made it longer is that awaiting my assessment, the COVID-19 pandemic struck, and afterwards, like all the healthcare professionals that were once affected to like less essential medical tasks, they were reaffected to like take care of COVID patients. Assessments for neurodevelopmental disorders were pretty much halted during COVID, and I was still expecting to be assessed at some point. So, since my mental health was declining and I didn't hear back from the assessment, and I was giving inappropriate support because I was assigned a occupational therapist to help me manage my challenge. But the thing is that I didn't have like an evaluation as to what was going on. So it's like we were like working in the dark. So I did a few sessions with her, but it clearly, since we didn't know what was going on, there was like no point. So my mom got tired of seeing me struggle in that situation and not being assessed. So we turned to a private clinic after 5 years of being in the waiting list and waiting, hoping that I would get assessed. So even if we decided that we would go private, the challenge was finding an assessor that would still perform assessments. So I think I spent another 6 months searching because I was giving resources even from my psychiatrist. My psychiatrist wouldn't, I asked him to evaluate me first, but he said that since he was not trained in the tools to evaluate autism, he didn't feel comfortable assessing me personally, but he could refer me out to other clinics. So he gave me a list of clinics, and I call all of them, and each one of them, either the waiting list was closed because there were too many people waiting, they were closing down doors themselves in general. They're no longer operating. In my own city, I didn't find any clinic that were assessing adults with autism at the time. So I had to turn to the other larger city that were Montreal, in which there were still clinics that were performing autism assessments. So that's what I did. And I ended up getting also diagnosed with autism on top of generalized anxiety disorder and ADHD. So my assessment was in December 2022, and I was diagnosed in like February 2023. So it's been a bit more than 2 years since it happened, and I think it really shifted my perspective as to like my whole identity ever since I found out.
Yeah, and just to backtrack a bit, because you're saying, like, yeah, it's true that back then a person couldn't have officially have ADHD and autism because of the DSM-5, and like before 2013, it couldn't be diagnosed in the same person. So I'm guessing that was the period when you had the impression that you couldn't be autistic. Is that correct?
Yeah,
Okay.
because I was diagnosed with in 2011.
Ah,
And
yeah,
then
yeah.
I was having these discussions with my friend in early 2013. So even though it was in the works that it would become permissible, it wasn't like yet mainstream idea that it was now permitted that people could have dual diagnoses of autism and ADHD. So I
Mhm.
think that contributed to the new wave of people like basically discovering that they're not just ADHD in the last few years.
I do wonder if we had access to diagnosis sooner, how much of getting passed around in the psychiatric world and the years of waiting and receiving. For me, like I was on medication like for depression for many years that did nothing.
Yeah, I did try a lot of medication for depression too, because I also happen to be not tolerant to stimulant medication for ADHD. And the way it works in my province is that in order to get diagnosed with non-stimulant medication for ADHD, you have to prove reasonably that you've tried other solutions in the stimulant category. So you have to have at least tried two different molecules and have tried like at least another antidepressant that may have effects on ADHD, and then it will be allowed that you might try another solution. I think that protocol sets people up, especially people who have both autism and ADHD, and who might be more sensitive towards stimulant medication for failure, because you have to like try medication that may not work for a few years before you're allowed to have a different option, which is, yeah, I wasted like years of my life being in treatment that was actively making me worse than I was before.
Yeah, for real. Was there anything in the evaluation process that helped the evaluator understand your support needs better?
I think it's like more because me, I have like a split support level. In terms of social communication, I have level one support, and in terms of restrictive and repetitive behavior, I have level two bordering level three support needs. So I think that's where the moderate support needs is very challenging because for me it's very hard for to like disengage from my routine, my special interest. My I become very stressed, and I it's also related to my functional assessment, how like I struggle with a lot of hygiene tasks. I struggle with a lot of instrumental acts of daily living where I need someone to help me in these areas. I need someone to help me more in the long-term planification too. So it's basically it's more all the instrumental ADLs for me, that represent the biggest challenge to autonomy, because I compare myself to, for instance, some of my friends who have level 1 support for low support needs. So some of them can still like maintain a house, maintain care for their finances long term without assistance or like with a partner. But for me, it's like I have been waiting for a case manager, like a social worker, to help me and to help me see appropriate resources to get like long-term help with that.
And how has getting the diagnosis helped? Because I know that getting the diagnosis for folks is not always a guarantee that you have access to accommodations at work or school.
I did with accommodations that are related to school. So I did have a few extra accommodations that were like related to, for instance, not being forced to do group work at university, and I could do my exams in a separate room, but I still struggled to have my accommodations enforced because of
Mm.
some resistance from the teaching body. And so that was helpful, but it was also like another challenge in itself because I now had to make them respect my accommodation, which wasn't always the case. It also helped me because last year, from May 2024 to May 2025, I was in a burnout and I didn't work. So I was able to secure employment insurance to still receive a salary when I was not working. And also it helped me because I'm now considered legally disabled by the federal government in my country. So I can receive like tax deductions. I can receive, for instance, a living credit. It's not a lot, but like and I can also open like a registered savings account for people with disabilities where the government contributes as well as a disabled person. So I think there's still, I don't know, advantages to getting diagnosed, but it's not accommodations and support services are waiting for you at the other end of the line. It's still, you still have to like work for it. And I think that's what's not necessarily enough talked about in autistic online spaces, because most low support needs struggle is related to obtaining that diagnosis in the first place. So a lot of people focus on like masking, not appearing autistic, or for instance, how to deal with clinician biases, how to find an appropriate accessory. Like a lot of us have been long past these issues, and we're now how to advocate for ourselves when you have that diagnosis, and how to make it that you don't have like inconsistent support services.
Yeah, yeah, thank you for bringing all of that up. And not to mention, it's a whole other job, like going through the paperwork of accessing these services.
It creates what's called access fatigue, which is like the structural fatigue that disabled people experience as a result of always navigating bureaucracy, always having to prove our disabilities, always having to advocate for ourselves, not being believed. So that all creates access fatigue, in which people, they still have needs, but they stop fighting for having their needs acknowledged and supported because they're just so tired of having to go through the mountains of the bureaucracy. And relatively privileged in the sense that I have bachelor's in communications, and I'm relatively good at navigating paperwork, but it's not because I understand the language. All the other steps, like having to mail it at a specific address or having to call between 12 and 4 at a specific place that that still creates an issue, especially when it comes to my executive functioning, where I can undertake these tasks and the follow-up and stuff, so I just get no support services.
Yeah, yeah. It's like an additional layer of labor that we don't get compensated for, and it extracts more energy and like attention from us. Yeah. Now I want to pivot to talking about the intersections of your experience, whatever you feel comfortable talking about in terms of the intersections of race, gender,
Mm-hmm.
queerness, chronic illness.
So I think that one of the biggest stress in general is the intersection of being Black, read as a woman, and being like autistic is because there's already like the indictment of women that people who are read as women that we should like care for others people's feelings and be like more in general, just more caring in it. And personally, it's not that I'm not caring, it's just that my personality isn't necessarily the warmest in general. And I'm quite like direct in general. I'm not necessarily the biggest hugger. So I think there's the expectations that I not only should like how I should give the information that I give as someone that does science communication and education and advocacy, as well as there's a lot of conflict that I come across that I aren't necessarily about the information that I share, but just the fact that it's me sharing the information in the first place. And that's one of the biggest obstacle that I face as someone trying to like make myself a space is that I'm always fighting for to be seen as legitimate educator and legitimate in the space that I'm in. So I'm like, I will have my handle is like Black Spectrum Scholar, but I will still be asked like, are you really autistic? Which would be odd to have a dedicated autism education page if I wasn't autistic in the first place, or like why would I call myself Black Spectrum Scholar if I wasn't autistic? So there's a lot of assumptions that I don't necessarily know what I'm talking about. I'm not legitimate. I shouldn't like say the things that I say in this tone because people won't necessarily hear me. I should add emojis so that people don't misunderstand my tone, which I all personally rebuke because I'm like, I shouldn't have to do anything more than just being polite and just communicating my message, which I've always been done. It's some a lot of time it's not enough for people to just present information as is and contextualize it. So I think that's been my my struggle, and in the same time that it's like for some people all the identities that I hold, the fact that I'm both agender, the fact that I'm an immigrant, the fact that I'm Black, queer, like all these autistic and ADHD, all these identities don't make sense because they don't imagine someone be having holding all these identities and being me. It's like I've talked about this often, and it's like in the last few years, the public image of someone that has autism or ADHD moved from being like a white boy, and it moved from being seen as a white woman condition. So it's like most people who express themselves online that I come across when there aren't like parent related pages, a lot of them are like white women. And it's with white supremacy, there's the tendency for some people to just see themselves as the norm or see themselves as the reference point. So like I've worked a lot to tell people that to not generalize, to not take their experiences of how they grew up and apply that to their words. Like for instance, I think a white autistic person a few weeks ago was saying that trains are to autistic boys as to horses are to autistic girls. And I'm like, if you think about having horses as a hobby, not just it for me, I've always associated liking horses with more white upper middle class hobby. So I'm like, is it really a white like autism, or is just a race how your race and class intertwines with how your autism manifests? Because for me, what I had available as a young immigrant was the library. And what's present at the library? A whole lot of books about World War II. What did I have access to? Like history books and encyclopedias. So I think that's what I was like hyper focusing on because that's what was available to me at the time. But like for see if someone has access to a ranch where they can go do some horseback riding, it's not necessarily how their autism presents, it's more the circumstances that they were led to be in as a result of their race, class, and other privileges. So I think that's how my autism tends to clash with other people, or a lot of people talk about the DSM as if it's the only diagnostic manual that exists, when in reality it's used by what Canada, the US, Australia, perhaps some parts of the UK, and it's like the when the ICD is the diagnostic model most people follow worldwide. So, and even most people are still, most countries are still out here using the ICD-11. So, for instance, they still diagnose Asperger's syndrome as a part of their diagnostic frameworks because it takes time, money, and resources in order to switch from a diagnostic framework to another. And a lot of countries from the global majority don't necessarily have the resources because they're actively focusing on other challenges that they're going through as a result of having been colonized.
Yeah.
A lot of people online are like, if someone uses Asperger's for any reason, that means that they associate themselves with Asperger's, Hans Asperger's, who was an Austrian scientist who participated into eugenics of like children with disabilities in World War II. And it's a bit more complicated than that, where people don't necessarily understand that the framework that people use in their own countries aren't necessarily the frameworks that are being used everywhere. And it's not necessarily because someone refers to what's being used in their country that they necessarily endorse the eugenics that Asperger's participated into. So I think there's a lot of Western centrism, Western centric and especially US centric ideals that are spread in your neurodiversity spaces. People assume that everyone should be using the same vocabulary. Everyone assumes that people are against the puzzle piece or person first language, for instance, where a lot of people are just either they just don't care, they're indifferent to these issues, or they're just it's just the least of their priorities. If you're someone an autistic child, and if you're an autistic child right now in Gaza, the least of your worries are probably conversations about the puzzle piece, or if someone calls you a person with autism as opposed to an autistic person. So it's like there's a lot of place that's being put for semantic discussions when we don't necessarily talk a lot about the structural challenges, and especially the structural challenges of people who are not from Western contexts.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. It makes me think of like how in many parts of Asia and in Singapore, like disabled folks prefer like person first language. And it's so context dependent. And so many accounts out there make things sound universal when they're not.
And that contributes to like alienating a lot of people. And especially it's even worse because it's for some people they don't have any like local communities who discuss these issues. It's not like they have in the US we have a lot of different autism organization have different viewpoints from one another. For instance, Autism Speaks and the Autistic Self Advocacy Network. Yeah, they're both autism organization and they both cover different perspectives of the autism community. But in other places, they don't have any other organization at all, or they just have one. So it's like people don't necessarily have the luxury of like picking and choosing which organization to stand behind, and they just have one local organization whose views might not necessarily align with the what views are being shared in the Western world. So it's there. I think because of cognitive rigidity in the autism community, it makes it very hard for people to have perspective taking as to how it maybe is for other people and put themselves in their shoes. Whereas I think my default mode as someone who comes from multiple marginalized background is to engage in perspective taking and try to see where the nuance lies in all that. Because it's like if I don't do this work of trying to like come through the nuance and the nitty-gritty of the situation and to understand where everyone is coming from, even though I might not legitimize their perspective. I just wanted to understand a lot of people just stay in their own position and don't necessarily try to understand other people without demonizing them.
Yeah, for sure. I don't spend a lot of time on social media. I only spent more time recently because I was like engaging in all of your content and also with Janella's content. And I'm horrified that there's still this backlash when prioritizing, especially Black and Brown autistic voices, that's seen as some kind of reverse racism or that, and like the accusations that have been hurled against you guys.
A lot of people accuse us of dismissing lived experience, but I'm like, whose lived experience are we prioritizing?
Yeah.
Whose narratives are being highlighted here. And it's like when you talk about lived, especially when for instance, a lot of people generalized about a strong sense of justice. And yeah,
Mm,
but I'm like, there's no data that can support this perspective. It's mostly shared anecdotally in our spaces, and it's mostly linked to moral righteousness rather than actually and cognitive and flexibility rather than actually being a trait of universal justice. Because especially now, how we see how people are reacting to Charlie Kirk's murder, people don't
mm,
have justice in the same place. Like our definition of justice don't mean the same for everyone. So I've always been like, people don't have a strong sense of justice. People just have a heightened investment in their own personal moral values, and they're more reactive. They have a heightened reactivity when said moral values or perspectives are, they feel like they're being not respected. But there's a lot of pushback because a lot of people are stuck in the loop of being seen as a good person, which is itself rooted in white supremacy. I personally have no qualms to being seen as a bad person. If people see me as a bad person, it is what it is. But I just want people to just be more honest with themselves, to just like, perhaps what I view as justice is not necessarily inherent to my neurodevelopmental disorder, but learned with all my different intersections, whether that's race, class, gender, immigration status, so on. So I'm just like, yeah, what you might perceive as justice for you it isn't going to be my perspective of justice.
yeah, I also just want to point out that Kaligirwa just wrote a really great piece on their Substack about why is it that people are asking and demanding us to grieve this person or to condemn this when they have not been condemning the harm and that has been caused to the lives of like Black, Brown, queer, trans people and people in Gaza and Congo and Sudan. I'm going to link the piece below.
Exactly. So we see the split in which some members of the autistic community are like, if you're celebrating this, that you are like morally corrupt or like a bad person, whereas other people who have been long dehumanized by Charlie Kirk's rhetoric and discourse are celebrating not necessarily the fact that gun violence was used as a mean to successfully deplatform him, but the fact that it is a fact of life that now he won't be able to inflict harm upon these marginalized communities. And I'm like, I'm in the camp where I personally think that I'm not gonna tell someone how to process the death of their oppressor personally. I think everyone has like the right to basically just process this event as they want to, but it's just that some people are indicting others that they should mourn, where some people don't feel like they have to mourn someone like that.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. I'm gonna definitely link the piece that you wrote below because I think it's a really helpful and important one. And thank you for bringing up all of this. Because, like, personally, I started this project because I was tired of, like, why do I have to learn about my neurodivergence from the way, like, algorithms have set up there to be like a default narrative, and it's always through whiteness. So I want to cover the fullness of our humanity. I always ask folks about what brings them joy, not just as like AuDHD joy, but like joy as a human being.
What brings me joy? I think it's for me. It's always learning. Like I think I'll be a lifelong learner. So I think learning is very important to my well-being, and I'm always trying to learn from research, learn from lived experience, learn from community advocates. So I think one thing that really brings me joy in that aspect is learning, and the other thing is very related to the creativity aspect, because by trade I'm a copywriter. So Basically, for me, like writing is a medium to just express my emotions, express my creativity. That's how I started my threads initially because I was on TikTok and Instagram, and I started my threads, and I think it's really helping me as a vehicle to process my feelings and especially about ongoing events, and as well as seeing other people's perspective in real time. And yeah, the creativity aspect because my one of my lifelong special interests is related to fashion and beauty. So I'm really like into the beauty space. I like discovering what new products have launched at Sephora, Ulta, or whatnot, and trying new products as well as putting together outfits and combinations. So I think that's what keeps me going in life.
It's awesome. I didn't know you're a copywriter too.
Yeah, I'm a copywriter. I work at advertising agency, so I think that I just started working after I graduated, and I love my job, what I do, because it's like just understanding the world and conveying meaning through words.
Yeah, yeah, same. Although I just quit. Yeah, partially it was because of their refusal to provide accommodations. I won't speak for every like ADHD person, but I just find it so much easier to communicate in writing.
No, me too. It's way easier to communicate writing. It's like I have to, I don't know, like it's like you have to put oil in the mechanism when I speak in order to be understand and like process say what I want to say. But when I write, it's like it's a lot clearer. That's why I don't make video content because I'm not the person I am pretty good at expressing myself through speech. I'm pretty good at expressing myself in writing, but when I try to get the same result in speech, it doesn't render the same.
So you've mentioned work. How do you navigate ADHD in other aspects of life, like in relationships?
I disclose all the time and in all contexts and every time. For instance, at my work, they know that I'm autistic and ADHD. In my friendships, they know too. My partner, my fiance, is also suspected to be autistic. So I think the fact that I also always disclose that I'm autistic and ADHD helps to set people expectations as to what they can expect from me and how I will behave. So that makes a lot less surprising when I do and when I am autistic and ADHD. And also because I don't really like camouflaging is not necessarily something I do that much. I'm more like someone that will compensate my challenges. And it's basically since I disclose in all settings, I basically so that it just helps me navigate interactions because I've already set the expectation up. So when I started working at my advertising agency, I think I told them the second day that I was there that I was autistic and ADHD and had also generalized anxiety disorder. And it helps connect with people that might share the traits that I have but don't necessarily have a diagnosis. So think that's I don't necessarily negotiate for my place and I just assume that I belong and then I just tell them about my condition and I assume that they will ride along with it. And so far it's worked.
Oh, that's really great to hear. I'm trying to do that more too. Because what I found like the more I hit, especially the workplace, and especially when I'm not burnt out and create this perception that I'm able to deliver and perform at the level that they're used to, then by the time like I'm actually struggling, they don't believe me.
I just realized that before when I worked before I had my degree, I was working for my wage because I was like not necessarily in a professional environment. But now that I work as a professional and I have acquired some skills through my degree, I'm paid for my expertise. So if I'm not working at like intensity, like I don't like if I finish my task and I have nothing else on my plate, I'm not gonna ask for anything until they assign me something else because I'm like, why would I take on more where I when I'm meeting the expectation of the work?
Yeah.
And if I do want to take on more, for instance, I'm inspired for a merch project at my workplace and I want to participate to doing some merch, then I will offer my help there and support of my colleagues, but I don't necessarily like I'm not in the mindset where I have to work at the full 8 hours of my day. Like for I might spend 30 minutes on my phone, 30 minutes playing with the dog in the office. Might spend like another hour talking with my colleagues, but I think that's all part of working. Like, it's
Yeah,
not because I'm not actively creating or writing something that I'm not necessarily working.
yeah, for sure. What's the biggest thing that you want other, especially late diagnosed, queer, ADHD, people of color, Black folks, Black and brown folks, especially like the most marginalized of folks, what would you want them to know to help them feel less alone?
I think it sounds like the magazine advice. Be unapologetically yourself, but in the way it's true that you have to be unapologetically yourself because there will be a lot of people as like that will try to tell you that the way that you are is not appropriate or is not. So I think there has to be some resilience built where you understand that some people's issues with you is their own projections, but also be open and teachable always because there will always be people more marginalized than us in the community. There will be always people who are like veterans in the community and who have a lot to teach us. So at the same time as being unapologetically yourself and not letting white supremacy dictates how you should like not falling into respectability politics, basically. You have to also remain teachable and accessible and remind ourselves that at the end of the day, even though we're all trying to advocate for ourselves, we're not going to be free until the most marginalized of us are free. So I think balancing both help us to be humble while also be affirming of our own identities and not letting ourselves being stepped on by like people who haven't deconstructed their white supremacy.
Yeah, yeah. And before we wrap up, what's the biggest thing we that you want the world to know, which could be policymakers, medical professionals, especially the people with the in positions where they wield a lot of systemic power over autistic and ADHD folks?
For advocacy organization and policymakers especially is to move beyond a single model of disability, a single model analysis of disability, because that ultimately will always leave people with multiple marginalized identities behind. Really moving either to stop either using the medical model of disability or the social model of disability alone and to move to other models that are more holistic, like the holistic model of disability, the intersectional model of disability, and so on, because I think the single axis analysis is really getting in the way of people with complex identity to get appropriate support.
Yeah. And Callie also has a really great post on breaking down the different models of disability, which I will link in the show notes. And how can we support your work and uplift your advocacy?
I think you can either follow me, share my resources like the infographics or the books and the research that I make available to other members of the community because I create these resources to reduce economic barriers because a lot of resources are hid behind a paywall or like a something that will ask your personal information and I really stand against that. So if you
Mhm.
can share the resources to people, and also if you have benefited from the resources as an individual or organization, you can always buy me a coffee on the link in my bio to help me support my work. So make us a donation of the amount you can to basically help me keep doing what I do and offer the resources for free.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your story, Kaligirwa. And Kaligirwa's story will also be in the Queer AuDHD BIPOC book. So everyone who's been interviewed for this project, they're going to be paid for their time. So if you pre-order the book, it will help fund this project. It will help us support more queer AuDHD BIPOC creators. And once all the project costs are funded, we will also be redistributing the sales to the Autistic People of Color Mutual Aid Fund, and to a disabled Palestinian family, my dear friend Nara, who has multiple sclerosis and cancer. Yeah, a lot of great reasons to support the book. And thank you so much for joining us today, Kelly.
My pleasure.